You all love good stories, don't you? I know I do. There is nothing like a really good story. It entertains us. It gravitates with us. Stories are the things of our lives. They tell our story, the story of people and the story of life as it goes. Some of the very best stories I like are crime stories. I do. Yeah, podcasts like True Crime All the Time, Canadian True Crime, stuff like Dateline. I mean, that stuff is just like, I eat that stuff up, and yeah, I know, Bonnie, you're kind of looking at me, but, it's my weakness. I do, oh, you too, okay, okay. And not only those, but I'm also kind of a history buff, so I like history stories. Things like Legends of the Old West, History Daily, those kind of podcasts I like too. Don't know how accurate they always are, but they're entertaining. And like I say, history is I'm a big history buff. But I think, as we talk about stories and as we listen to stories, there is nothing like a life or a story that we hear that is true. And I'm reminded, when I go to a movie, a lot of times that movie will be done on a historical event or will be done on a book. I don't always read the book, and I should obviously read the book because the book is the true thing which the movie came from. And I've had people tell me, well, some are pretty close and some are, way out there. Not what the book intended, but that's just the way it is. Everybody does things like that. But they say that this story oftentimes is based on a true story. And that truth may be loosely done. And sometimes they are actually closer to the story. But whatever the case may be, there always is going to be some liberty taking in the telling of those stories. They may not be incredibly accurate, but instead something like this happened. Yet we as human beings, we as people, we who love stories, want to be told a genuine story, a true story. And we can be very disappointed sometimes when that story isn't true. Because nothing captivates our hearts, nothing draws us in like a true story. Because they are the most compelling and inspirational and even life-changing. And that is what we as human beings most desire. And as we talk about stories this morning, I want to ask you a question straight out. Have you ever thought of your life as a story? Well, it is. Your story is your journey through life. And each one of your stories is important because every one of your lives tell a story. And all of our lives are based off of some other kind of story. Things that we follow, things that we observe, things that we read, our life living with our families, and so on and so forth. Every one of us, and here's the thing I want to emphasize this morning. Every one of us are either basing our lives on a true story or we're basing them on a false story. We might be basing our lives on how we interact with each other, how we view the world, how we look at God. And the worldview we are viewing life through can sometimes be false. And it's possible, even as committed Christians, followers of Christ, to be basing our lives off of a false story. And in particular, as a Christian, I need to ask myself, what is the story that I'm patterning my life after? Is how I'm looking at God, how I look at life, how I look at accidents, how I look at miracles, how I look at suffering, how I look at myself and other people, how I look at joy. Is all of that based on a correct or incorrect story? You know, in the ancient world of Rome, there was a story about the Caesar who conquered the known world, and he established what was called the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. The Pax Romana was said to be a peaceful time of prosperity and order in Rome. It was a story from Caesar. It was a story from Caesar declared to the rest of the world, to the known empire that the Roman Empire was. And Caesar called it the good news. Now, that good news might work for you if you were wealthy, if you were privileged, if you had food, if you were a man, but you couldn't base your life off that story because it wasn't completely true. Caesar had his good news, which people tried to live in his way, but they soon discovered that they couldn't, because there were a lot of places where there were holes in it, places of brokenness where there were hopelessness and sorrow that couldn't be healed, and a lot of trouble that couldn't be dealt with. If you weren't wealthy or aristocratic, if you were a conquered people and under Roman oppression, his idea of peace didn't apply to you. There were huge gaps between the rich and the poor. Women couldn't get jobs, so in those days they turned to prostitution. When the Romans forced the Jews to worship Roman gods, as you probably know in your history, they refused to do that. They rebelled. So what did the Romans do during Pax Romana? Well, they forced, they refused to worship the Roman gods, and the Romans ended up killing about 10 million Jews, about 1 million Jews, pardon me. And a lot of times they just tortured them to death. See, the Jews believed that they should worship, the Ten Commandments told the Jews to worship God and nothing else. So in this so-called time of peace, there was anything but peace. So the Pax Romana was a false story for many people to base their stories upon. And here, in the middle of all that that's happening, here comes the Apostle Paul. In his letter to the Thessalonians, he said, "We came to you proclaiming not the gospel of Caesar, but the gospel of God, the good news of God." He just said, when we came, we proclaimed the good news of God. And in Acts 17:2-3, he proclaimed, we are told that when we went to Thessalonica, he went to the synagogue service, and for 3 Sabbaths in a row, he used the scriptures to reason with the people and proclaim the true story. He explained the prophecies and proved that the Messiah must suffer and rise from the dead. He said, this Jesus I'm telling you about is the good news, is the message, is the Messiah who would bring peace, justice, and hope to the world, to the whole world. And Jesus, the Messiah, had come to accomplish this. And this is the true story that you can base your life upon. You could base your relationship with Christ on this story because the story not only is for this life, but it extends into eternity. Based on the story of Christ who was crucified and rose again and sits at the right hand of the Father and intercedes for us. And when this life is done, we have the opportunity to enjoy him forever. And that's the truth that he wants to bring to us. That's the hope, that's the peace that he wants to give us. In verse 4 of Acts 17, we find out that some of the Jews who listened were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, along with many God-fearing Greek men and quite a few prominent women. Well, what had they heard? They had heard this true message of hope, of peace, of purpose with a future that they wanted to follow. And the question for us in 2023 is this: do we know that story? Do we know the good news? Do we believe the good news of the gospel? See, if someone were to observe you and ask what you are basing your life upon, could you say, could I say, yes, I'm basing my life upon someone who drives my life, that guides my life, and gives it vision and focus? Could we tell that true story? The true story of Christ, the Christ that we base our lives upon. Well, we can do that as we commit to pattern our stories on his epic story. The good news is that it will transform your heart and mind in a definite way. And the result of that is you will approach God and the world in an entirely different way. You know, in ancient times, if you believed in other pagan gods, like in the Greek times, like Zeus or Hera, or Athena or Aphrodite, well, if you stop to think about them, you'd realize these gods and goddesses weren't good. And here's why. None of them are just. None of them care about you. They don't know your name. And they definitely don't love you. So how do you approach a God like that? Well, first off, for the most part, you don't. Because they don't want to know you. So there's only this, you would only approach them in this way for two reasons. Number one, you were so desperate that for the thing that you needed, whether it was for your crops to succeed, or for victory in war, or to become pregnant. You'd be willing to risk the God's attention to get what you desperately wanted, all the while remembering that those same gods didn't care about you. They're not just, they're not good, and they were very disloyal. They would rather curse you than bless you. And secondly, the whole idea was to appease those same gods. You'd want to keep them off your back, and you'd want to keep them out of your life. I remember when my youngest daughter, Allie, was a little girl, and she went over to her friend Ina's place for a sleepover one night. Or not a sleepover, but she went over after school. And she remembers that when they were up playing in her room, and her grandmother came up. Now Ina and her family are Sikh. But her grandmother came up to her room and he says, whatever you girls do, don't point your feet at your closet door. Why? Because there's statues of holy men in there. There's a shrine in there. And you would be in trouble if you did that. It kind of sounds ridiculous, huh? Well, you know what? We can do that too. We can keep God at a distance. We can limit our time in God's Word and praying. We can go to church once a week. And the rest of the time left is ours. That could be the story we're basing our lives upon. I don't trust in God, and I don't want to get close to Him. Maybe what I really want to do is to keep Him at arm's length. I can pray only when I'm desperate or trying to appease God, which in turn can affect how I regard other people as well. And in those other stories of creation, gods and goddesses created human beings only because they needed slaves. They didn't make them because they loved them or cared for them. They made them so they could work while they carried on a life of leisure. You see where this is going? You see the false story that is being made here? And I want to tell you, if that was a story you're basing your life on, then it's a broken one. Because there's no purpose to life, to friendships, to family, and especially to your existence. The only things worth living for are power and pleasure. And if that's it, why go on? That's the story they were basing our lives upon, and in modern times, we're doing the same thing. You know, in our ways, our culture, we're just like them. We can live in a kind of deism just like they did. Whereas when I say deism, I say God is there, but he's kind of uninterested. He's kind of uninvolved, and as a result, he's completely uninvolved unless we have some kind of crisis. And in our culture, so many young and old people are basing their lives on that kind of story in 2023. The kind where God is uninvolved, uninterested, and is only needed when we have some kind of a problem. See, what that's really saying is there's no purpose. Life just happens. It's all a result of random chance, and so are you. And you and I are the result of random chance, and our lives are essentially disposable. Imagine living in that kind of a story. There was a young couple who graduated from Bible college, and they had gone over to China, and they were trying to bring the good news of God, the gospel, to people over there, to a nation where people had been stripped of the ability to talk with God. He recalled that one of the more tragic moments they experienced was in a conversation with a young Chinese man, and they were trying to reveal to him the great dignity of the human person created in the image of God. Know what that man said? He replied, "Oh no, I don't mean anything. I am irrelevant because if you get rid of me, there are 90 million people just like me. I'm not special." That's the kind of worldview that we are walking through in modern times. It's a false worldview that we're basing our lives on, and it has eternal consequences. 4 years ago, there was an article that came out of the Detroit Free Press that was entitled, "Why is Living Shorter and Dying Sooner the New Trend?" In it, the reporter highlighted the fact that 2018 was the first time in 100 years where life expectancy had declined. Now, these are American figures. I'll come up with some Canadian stats for you later. Had declined in Americans for 3 years in a row. And that hadn't happened in 100 years. When was the last time that occurred? 1918. What happened at that time? Well, there was a World War I, that decimated a massive number of the world's population, and then what did we have? We had the Spanish flu. The pandemic came in, and 15 million people died as a result of that. What they found from the decline in life expectancy in 2018 was significant. And the cause for these deaths were described in this way: death by despair, death by suicide, alcoholism, and opioids. There was a study from last month in the US that revealed that 25% of young adults aged 18 to 24, had seriously considered taking their own lives in the past month. This is just a short time ago. And the rate of suicide has increased down there in every year for the past 13 years. In children aged 10 to 14, suicide is the second leading cause of death, a rate that has tripled in the US over the last 14 years. And you think we're not a part of susceptible to that? Here's Stats Canada's figures. Approximately 12 people die by suicide each day. Approximately 4,500 deaths are by suicide, and that occur every year. Suicide rates are approximately 3 times higher among men compared to women. And suicide is the leading cause of death among youth and young adults aged 15 to 34 years. And here we are in the Western world with all this affluence, all this wealth, everything we could want. Things are getting better and better for us. We have more stuff, yet more and more people are unhappy. And what's tragic is more and more people are taking their lives. The opioid epidemic, and that's what it is, has wreaked tragic consequences in the lives of a great number of people. And we hear it on the news every day about what happens. For example, as of 2023, less than 15% of the world's population live in North America, yet over here we consume over 80% of the world's opioids. Why? Well, I believe it has something to do with the reality that so many people are basing their lives off of a false story, an untrue gospel. One that said that God is distant, that God is irrelevant to you, that life is an accident, a gospel that says the only things that matter are pleasure and power, and as I said before, if you don't have those, you might as well give up. But here's the good news. What does Paul say in Thessalonians? We came to you proclaiming the gospel of God in a new story with good news, a true story that you can base your life upon. You heard about a bunch of gods that are disloyal, unjust, and they weren't good. But here's what I need you to know. God is one. God is good. God is just. And God knows your name. He also counted every hair on your head. He knows everything about you. And get this, he actually cares for you. You are the apple of his eye. The God who at creation said, "Let there be light," and after every act of creation, he said, "That's good. That's very good." So not only is God good, he made a world that is good too. And at the peak of his creation, he says, "Let us make man in our own image." And so he did, male and female. Everybody is made good in God's story. Not disposable, not irrelevant, because they are made in God's very image and likeness. We learn that when Paul went to Thessalonica, he told the Romans this: the gospel is the power of God to change lives. And if you were living your life based on a false story, and you got just a taste of the gospel, of the true gospel of Christ, you could actually live your life based on a true story that would have power, a power to transform your life, a power to give your life meaning, truth, and a hope and a future. The gospel story is the true story of the power of God to intercede for us, for our good. And it has the power to change our hearts so that we can leave a life of despair and instead start a new life of hope, purpose, joy, and peace. The gospel, this good news, has the power to change the whole world and break the power of sin. And it's for everyone. You know what? One of the best things we can discover as we base our lives on this true story? That we were made for relationship with God and with one another. When Paul talked to the Gentiles in Thessalonica, their image of God was one where you had to fight for attention. If you were desperate enough or you wanted to keep them off your back, you'd have to fight for God's attention, and they could do themselves a lot of harm to get it. They could cut themselves. They could torture themselves. You think about Elijah the prophets of Baal there up in the mountain. What did they do? They began to, well, things weren't working for the prophets. They couldn't get fire to fall from heaven and burn up the ox. So what did they start doing? They started hurting themselves. They started cutting themselves. They gave themselves a lot of pain and trauma. That's the story their life was based on. Now here comes Paul to declare to them, saying, I came among you to showed you how necessary it was for Jesus, the Christ, to suffer and to die. Imagine having based your life on a false story all this time, that in order to get God's attention, you'd have to suffer. You'd have to bleed. Instead, imagine the story, true story, is that God so desires your attention, that God so desires to fight for your heart, that he's the one who is willing to suffer for you. That he is the one who's willing to bleed for you. The God who loves you more than you could ever imagine or comprehend. This is the good news, ladies and gentlemen. This is the gospel of God that has changed the world, and it has the power to change your life. And to change your story. And that happens when you decide to base your life, your story, on his true story. So God bless you. Please let God into your life if you haven't. If you have, keep on doing right what you're doing. It's the greatest way to live. It builds you up. It gives you security. It gives you peace and hope and a future. It is a true story, and you can take it and make it your story. God bless you.